The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today is Minnesota State Senator Jane Ranum of Minneapolis and Richfield. She's the chair of the Legislative Commission on Children, Youth, and Their Families. Senator Ranum will be discussing how the commission is working with the executive branch, with state agencies, and other child and family advocates to develop state policies on children's and family issues. Senator Ranum, it's a pleasure to have you on All About Kids today. You're the chair of the Legislative Commission on Children, Youth, and Their Families, and this commission is taking a real leadership role in setting a policy statement for children and their families in Minnesota. What's some of the background?
Well, the commission was first created by the legislature in 1991, and the need for the commission came as a result of seeing how fragmented programming for children and their families were. And one of the causes we realized for that fragmentation was perhaps the way the legislature was set up. An issue regarding children might appear on the Education Committee, another part of it might surface in Health and Human Services, and yet committees didn't necessarily know what the others were doing. So legislation was passed so that representatives of the key committees who dealt with issues affecting children and their families could come together in a bipartisan way and begin to evaluate programming, and so that we were having an opportunity in a fundamental way to look at the systems, the educational systems, the health and human services systems, and the health systems as it related to children and families. As I said, this commission was created in 1991, but funding for it, unfortunately, was vetoed by the governor in 91. It was only in this past session in 1993 that we got funding to have a staff position for this commission. I'm very excited as the chair because we, last year, the commission, and members of the commission, I should say, led the fight for the Family Services Collaboration language, which gave planning and implementation grants to communities to better get at the table and begin to see how the counties, the health departments, and the school districts could better work together along with community groups.
I think this is one of the most interesting things because so often money goes to those institutions who continue to do things the way we've always done them, in a bureaucratic way. And you're actually forcing all of us who work in large bureaucracies to listen to the people that we're serving.
Well, maybe it's because I grew up out in the country, but so often we see for instance, in Hennepin County, that people don't even know who the other folks are that are dealing with the same kids and the same issues. And we tried to come up with some way that would actually get key policymakers together at the table to begin to talk with each other and try to get away from this fragmentation of funding, because that's the key. You can spend lots and lots of monies on families and children, but if it's going to keep a bureaucracy and not getting the services of the family and children, it really doesn't do much good.
So the families would be terribly frustrated because for some services they'd have to go to one department, other services.
We heard horror stories about families actually having to fill out 10, 12, 15 different forms to get get services for their children. And so some of the things that we anticipate will happen will be a common form, so that a family only has to fill out one form, and yet that form can be used in different ways to help the family get the services it needs, whether it's WIC or funding for health care needs or services for a disabled child, whatever. The family only has to fill out one form.
If you have that kind of a simplification, then the people who are providing the services have more time to actually work with the families.
That's right.
That need their services.
It's my belief that most people that work with families and children got into that because they really wanted to serve, but what we hear over and over again about the frustration that they have with the paperwork and the bureaucracy, and so that they're not really utilizing their time to really help the people that they wanted to help in the first place.
Was it kind of hard to convince the counties and the school districts, for instance, that it was terribly important for them to work together?
I think it's fair to say that in this era where monies are scarce, often people are beginning to realize there's not going to be that much more money. So what we tried to do, instead of using the word force, is had a carrot. And the carrot was having availabilities of some dollars that they could apply for that would enable them to do some more thoughtful planning. Because what we found in recent years is that dollars really haven't been used by our governmental agencies to do the long-term planning that they should, nor have dollars gone for evaluation. So we at the state level were trying to say, we'll give you a carrot. If you folks will come together, we will help you with some dollars to do that.
I think the evaluation component is important too, because so often we do services for many years. We never look at whether those services continue to be effective, whether they're actually meeting the needs of the people we're looking at. So by evaluation, then, if a program has shown that it's outlived its usefulness, or perhaps never even was very useful, it will be eliminated, and that money will be spent for something else.
Key. Absolutely. We're hearing that over and over again, whether you look at it in the educational field when they're saying, let's look at the outcomes. So often programs in the past have been funded based on how many people were served. Well, it doesn't really make much difference if people are served if at the end of the service the families' lives and the children's lives weren't improved. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a way to evaluate what's happening in these families in a way that empowers families, not just crossing off, oh, we served 2,000 people. The number of people served is only one indication of what a program is doing.
It's kind of comparable to the situation in the library, where we always talk about the number of books we circulate, but not necessarily on whether people are actually reading them.
That's
or whether
correct.
some of our other services are key. Well, in addition to collaborating or instilling the need to collaborate with counties and schools, you've been doing a lot of work at the state level too. You're cooperating with the Governor's Action for Children Commission, and you've actually been sitting down at the table with representatives from the various state agencies. How is this going?
We just completed, as you said, a historic series of working meetings with the Children's Cabinet, and in fact, for the first time, jointly hired a staff person to assist us in looking at governance issues jointly between the Legislative Commission and the Children's Cabinet. And for those folks that don't know, the Children's Cabinet are the heads of the agencies like Education, Health and Human Services, Health Department, Transportation, Finance, all of the different agencies that in one way or another come in contact with families and children. And what we found during this process is, number one is how important it is that we talk. Because if one agency or if the executive branch is going off in one direction, but is not chatting with the legislative branch, who are the ones that have to fund things, nothing is going to get accomplished. And this series of joint meetings was so useful from the standpoint of we were talking in depth, and what we found is more what we had in common with regard to children and families, and what agenda, as opposed to making sure is one branch going to get credit for it versus the legislative. I mean, is the legislative branch going to get credit or is the executive? If we're going to help families and children, we have to get away from that. Who's going to take credit for things? We have to start working together.
Well, I think this will make a big difference too when your constituents begin to see that there is this kind of communication, that turf barriers are being broken down, and it actually is going to result in much quicker action. That was one of the things too that I was interested in. Not only do you want to develop policy, but you want action on that policy.
Well, we also found that frequently, and I think justifiably so, the state is criticized by local units of government as well as other people for having all these mandates and yet exempting themselves. What we began to realize with this collaborative effort is we can't just talk it, we have to act it. And so when people, what we heard from folks is, number one, this collaboration thing, if you are really sincere about it, stay with it. And number two, you are demonstrating that you really are interested in this by what you do. And I think a lot of people were, number one, surprised that we did it, but number two, I think they actually were pleased.
Well, it's a bipartisan committee. You have representatives from both sides of the aisle and from both Senate and House. So
That's
you
correct.
really do have lots of institutional barriers to break down.
And we have some key people on that commission who are in positions to really change things. On the House side, we have Representative Kathleen Valenga, who's chair of the Education Finance Committee. We have a new member on the Senate side, Senator Miriam, who is chair of the Finance Committee. Now, those are two key people who are in powerful positions to influence their colleagues on agendas for children and families.
I think that's an important thing that's happened with the commission too, because often children's and families issues get a lot of lip service, or there's a lot of rhetoric around them, but real men or real legislators deal with things like money. And of course, no changes can be happening in the system until the money is there to make those changes happen.
I couldn't agree with you more. One of the reasons, for instance, that the Children's Cabinet includes the Department of Transportation is because we are finding as a commission that one of the most important barriers to services for families and children has been transportation. And that is why you see the whole issue of framing what should transportation dollars be used for? Because first of all, in the past, the transportation budget has been huge, but by and large at the state level, I think something like 1% of the state budget is used for transit. And so a good example with our changing demographics, especially our senior citizen population who are transit after a certain time become very transit dependent. If we don't expand those services for them, then they're becoming far more isolated and more likely to have to enter nursing homes, which are very expensive at sooner time than they have to. The same thing for children. If we can get services so that families can get to the programs that they need, perhaps we can help keep children out of costly foster care placements and things like that, and in the end have more money to empower families, not be putting them in a criminal justice system.
Well, there's a myth that access in the metropolitan area to services is just available, and yet many people living in suburban areas have no cars. There's very little public transportation, so even getting to a grocery store can become a major chore for a woman with a couple of small children, or a woman without small children.
That's correct.
It must be an interesting experience to have people from transportation sitting down and talking with early childhood educators or program facilitators.
I think what we're finding, again, with that working program that we had is it was interesting to have the Commissioner of Housing, Commissioner Solem, at the table, because he knew how important some of the housing issues were to the stability of families. It was real important to hear the dialogue, not only among the different people on the executive side, but have that exchange with the Legislative Commission. The thing that the Commission has identified as the most important issue that they're going to work on this year is information. And I know that doesn't sound like a very classy title.
I'm a librarian. It's a wonderful.
But what we are finding is that most of our information systems have been set up for operational purposes. And then incidentally, they're used to develop policy. Well, that's not a good way to really have effective policy, because if you don't ask the right questions to begin with, you may not be getting the information you need. And we especially hear that from communities of color. They are saying you can't, the Department of Human Services can't even tell you how many kids are in out-of-home placements by race. And so the Supreme Court Racial Bias Task Force talked over and over again about how important accurate information is for us to better make the criminal justice system more effective for all the citizens, not just some citizens.
One of the other issues you're considering is data privacy.
Yes.
And
making
information between various departments.
Right. In fact, we're going to be discussing at the commission meeting on Wednesday some legislation that will better able for instance, probation officers, under very tight circumstances, to share information with the schools regarding children that are on probation, so that children in the schools are safe from the standpoint of if kids are coming back in the schools that have had experiences with violent crime, that we're making sure that our schools are safe, and that under very tight, stringent circumstances, information that is needed to help the community and the criminal justice system reintegrate with each other is available.
What are some of the other things you're doing with the juvenile justice system?
Well, one of the major issues at the legislature this year will be proposals to bring major change to the juvenile justice system. I served on Justice Gardebring's task force, Supreme Court task force. We're going to be doing a series of things. First of all, we're going to be making it easier to certify some of the more violent juveniles. What certification is a process where a juvenile who is under the age of 18 can be held accountable as an adult. We're going to be making some changes to make that much easier, looking at the folks who are the much more violent ones. What we currently have is a situation where you can either certify a child as an adult, or no matter what the situation is, if they're not certified at 19, they're off probation and we can't hold them accountable. What we are doing, and we're the first state in the nation to do this, is we're saying that black or white, that one box or the other doesn't quite make sense. We're proposing the creation of a middle tier called the serious youthful offender, which will give a juvenile disposition, at the same time have a disposition that has been stayed, that is an adult disposition. And so if the juvenile successfully completes all the requirements, fine, that he will still remain as a juvenile. But if he should violate the conditions of probation, he or she will be treated exactly as an adult, get all his sentence or her sentence will be executed as an adult, and they'll have all the criminal history points, everything as if they were adult. We're trying to really put some teeth so that juveniles can no longer say juvenile court is a joke. At the same time, and one of the things that we think is most important is, the task force said over and over again, you've got to have prevention in here. You've got to have better mental health assessments of juveniles when they're first coming in the system. You've got to have more programming that is prevention oriented, and that means everything from parenting programs for teen fathers and teen mothers to chemical dependency programs for conflict resolutions. But we also have recognized that you have to have programming on the other end. We have, sadly enough, a need in the state for secure capacity, which means in some instances we're at this point in time we have no secure facilities. The task force is recommending a minimum of secure bedding be available along that continuum of programming. The key will be to the passage of this is whether or not the legislature is going to put in resources to make this thing work. And
rather than, again, mandating that each county has to do it itself.
It can't happen right now. What we are arguing is that one of the reasons why we haven't had the resources at the community level is that sadly, because of the increasing number of violent juveniles, that we're spending all our resources on the most difficult instead of doing it across a continuum to make sure that we're doing the preventive things to keep this kid from being a recidivist. And
working closely with the families.
Yes,
too, with that.
And we haven't done that. And so a child can do well in a very structured program, but then he or she can come back in the community. And if there hasn't been that careful reintegration program back in the community, guess what happens? It doesn't work.
You've mentioned community, and you talked a little bit about the concern of members of the communities of color, that their viewpoints weren't being represented. When we're involved in radical systemic change, we keep hearing we must involve parents of children who are in schools. We must involve parents of preschoolers who are in early learning programs. And I think that's one of the hardest things to do. We have our ways of doing things in every bureaucracy, and to listen to people who may not be coming from our background or just have different ways of looking at things. How do you think we who are working with children and families can do a better job of getting community members involved so that they feel that their viewpoints are important and listened, not just sitting there and listening to us talk?
Well, that is one of the key things that the Commission is working on right now, and what we are hearing over and over again is that representatives from communities of color have to be at the policy boards at the very beginning. We can't continue to develop policy and then ask communities of color to respond to it. And we've got to re-examine, for instance, I want to give credit to the Children's Cabinet. At the sub-cabinet level now, which are the assistant commissioners on that children's sub-cabinet, are now representatives from the councils, the 4 councils of color, the Black Americans, the Asian Pacific, the Spanish-speaking council, and the Asian council, so that when those key policy decisions are being made, before anything goes any further, you are really hearing how communities of color are going to respond to this. We have to do that we give lip service that we want our policy boards to be more diverse, but I don't think that we are making those extra steps at the front end to make sure that those diverse opinions are coming in.
What we found, in addition to people from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, there is people with lower educational levels, and people for whom poverty is a way of life. It's very, very difficult to get input from those people into making some decisions.
One of the things we have to do is, before we develop policy, is make sure we're really going out into the communities, not holding meetings and doing it the typical way, but making sure we're really doing things differently about getting real input.
Developing relationships with people that are trusted in the community.
Yeah. And listening also to people who are our customers, who we serve. That's not always done.
What if they say things we don't like?
Then that's even more important that we hear it. Because sometimes we have a way of thinking we're doing it for the greater good, but we have to step back and think, wait a minute, how would the child or the parent that was receiving this services react to that? Because ultimately that's what government's supposed to do, is to serve people. And sometimes we've gotten that flip-flopped.
Telling them that you must read to your children when perhaps getting food on the table or a light bulb in the hall is a higher priority.
I think it can be done together. I think that it's the way it's presented in a culturally appropriate way can make all the difference in the world. As someone that's worked in government a long time, not as an elected official, I've always found that if you can get somebody's trust, there's so much that can be done, but so often people have not felt like they were a real person in the system. And so the trust factor is dramatically reduced. That's a part of training. That's a part of helping those of us that want to serve folks to be better, to be more sensitive to those kinds of things, and listen carefully to how other cultures view something that we've never thought about because we weren't in that culture.
Do you think the Legislative Commission is serving as a model for other parts of state government to do away with some of the fragmentation of services? That people are looking at you to say, they're doing it, we can reinvent too?
Well, what I'm hoping is that in this era when people are talking about government being more consumer friendly, that everybody is trying to look at. They don't have to model after what the Commission's doing, but what they're doing is stepping back and saying, wait a minute, what's our mission here? And if our goal is to help consumers, how best can we serve the consumers, which is a different way than saying, how can we make things more efficient? That's a different question than how can we improve services for people.
This is a little bit off the point, but I think it's important now. You've had a lot of experience in government. You're working with some highly qualified leaders in our state. If we do institute term limits, won't much of this background and experience be lost as we try to redesign these services?
Well, I can tell you, as someone who has grave concerns about term limits, the thing that I see is that positive change usually occurs when you have a combination of folks who have enough experience to know the institutional history combined with new blood that is looking at the current system from more fresh perspective. What I fear most in the whole issue of term limits is that the end result will be you only have new folks, and then the bureaucracy, the people that are in the agencies will actually be running things. It won't be policymakers who were, oh yes, 6 years ago we went through that and it didn't work then.
And bureaucracies do tend to perpetuate themselves. It's much more comfortable.
They certainly can. And again, as someone that's worked in, for instance, the criminal justice system for many years, I know that it's important. There's so many complex issues in government today. You cannot be an expert on everything. And so it's really important to have folks that have the experience and the background. But believe me, I certainly understand why proponents of term limits are out there. They're saying we can't continue to just have the same folks. At the same time, remember, there are disadvantages to not having institutional memory as well.
We've got just a little bit of time left, but you're also interested in doing a little work at the federal level, getting our Minnesota congressional delegation involved in some of the changes you're making.
It is critical that the same dialogue that occur between, for instance, the legislature in Minnesota and the executive branch go on to Washington, because what we know is there are billions of dollars that are funded at the federal level for programs for families and children, and yet they are very fragmented. And if we don't coordinate with our federal delegation, inadvertently new legislation may pass that actually adversely affects what we're trying to do here.
Once again, Minnesota is going to be a leader.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Senator Ranum.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Jane Ranum. The Legislative Commission on Children, Youth, and Their Families is truly working to make children and families Minnesota's top priority. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.